Hello, this is John with wesleygospel.com. Today I'm going to go over warnings against pastoral abuse. Um, I have, out of all the little podcasts I've done over the years, this subject has gotten one of the most attentions, other than me me podcasting on angelic lights. Most of the time, when people see my podcast on angel sparkles or angelic lights, they're like, "Whoa, what is that?" It's so weird and shocking. But um, pastoral abuse is also weird and shocking because it's an experience that a lot of people have unfortunately had, but very few people have really given voice to it, and and it does provide some degree of sanity to people who have experienced emotional harm in this area or still have grudges and need deliverance, honestly, when they experience what is also called spiritual abuse. And so if anybody's in a state of revival, if a pastor has a good heart and his heart's in the right place and he doesn't want that wants that to be the last thing that he's ever guilty of before God, I'm going to go over some things. I did do a video on this. If you look at it on my Wesley Gospel YouTube, there is an old video. It's like 10 years old. It's a video I did, and I'm not very neat, well put together, and it just needs to be redone. Let's just put it that way. And so I'm going to go over my booklet that I did, which is called Pastoral Abuse. It's 39 pages. It's for free on wesleygospel.com on the ebook section. This is some pretty heavy metal stuff right here. So you might need to take it, especially if you're in ministry. Might need to take this in chunks rather than all at once. This was an adaptation that I did when I was reviewing Churches That Abuse by Ronald Enroth. And I just want to say this: harm that is done to people in a ministry context can come either one, on purpose, or two, by accident. So there's a thing called intentional harm, which is basically the definition of evil. Intentionally trying to harm another person. That's evil. And then there's accidental harm, which is just an accident and is the result of the imperfections and temptations of man. If I was ever in a pastoral ministry position, God help me, you know. I know that I have a bad temper, so I don't know how long I would be able to maintain perfect sanctification in these areas, but these things do need to, especially in revival settings where people are really trying to do the right thing, these things need to be addressed, because if you're subscribed to Christian Post like I am, pastors are getting attacked every single day. Every single day. That's just quote unquote their ministry over there at Christian Post. Exposing sexual predators in the ministry seems to be one of their favorite things to do there. So that and just, spiritual abuse, though, probably happens way more often in ministry than than the sexual type, which turns into some newspaper scandal. What you're going to find oftentimes pastors falling into are power trips. Um, and this is sociological stuff. So what I'm talking about here are basically things taken from case studies, extreme case studies of ministries that went wrong. And then Ronald Enroth was a sociologist in 1992, brought all the case studies together and put together this book called Churches That Abuse. So this is not theory. This is information extracted from case studies. What you're going to find, though, unfortunately, a lot of pastors fall into power trips. Matthew 23, 9-10 says, "Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven, and do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ." So, in the Catholic Church, they call priests father, and that is so unbiblical. right? We have Protestant versions of this where we could call each other Pastor so-and-so, or Reverend so-and-so, or even Brother John. But, you know, if you really be honest about it, I mean, you look at the book of Acts, you look at the Gospels, everybody's calling each other a first name basis. The only person who has a title is Jesus. He's called Rabbi. That's it. That is it, you know. But everybody else, you know, it's just Peter, James, John, you know. It's not the Apostle Paul. It's just Paul, Barnabas. You know, everybody's on a first name basis there. And it's not that First Timothy, Second Timothy, and Titus don't. I mean, those who labor in the word are supposed to receive double honor. Not only honor through being supplied financially, but also honor and respect for laboring in the word. I'm not trying to say that they're not supposed to be honored for the work that they do. But in terms of approachability, when you look at the guy, Reverend Alden, on Little House on the Prairie, you know, the thing about Little House on the Prairie is that the objective of the program, I believe, when Michael Landon put that show together, was to illustrate several things. The perfect father, what he's supposed to be like, that was Charles Ingalls. The perfect mother, what she's supposed to be like, that was Carolyn Ingalls. The perfect pastor, that's what Reverend Alden was like. And although he was called Reverend Alden, the guy was approachable. Even little kids felt like they could come up to him and ask him questions, right? There was an approachability there. But with pastors who have a power trip, you see the shade of Satan in them. And there's a fear and an intimidation about it, and people are just afraid to get close. There's no love there. 1 Timothy 3, 2-5, the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him, and he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? So a prerequisite of a biblical pastor is that he has to be a really good biblical father. That's the prerequisite. And so when Catholic priests presume to be pastors and they don't even have a family, they're doing something that's not biblical there. The Bible requires pastors to have a family, and it requires that they do a good job at being dads. That is a prerequisite for ministry. Ephesians 6:4, fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Well, there it is. One of the best studies of biblical parenting that I've ever seen is by William Gouge, Domestical Duties. It's a Puritan book. And he basically says that, this verse about fathers provoking their kids to wrath boils down to two things: too many rules for their kids, and then extreme punishments. So if basically when kids are given too many rules, they're bound to make a mistake. They're basically being set up for failure when kids are given too many rules. And then when they do make a mistake, boom, here comes an extreme punishment again. Ha ha ha, right? So the kid's always making mistakes because there's literally no way around it because there's so many freaking rules on this kid. And then when he does make a mistake, ha ha ha, here comes an extreme punishment, right? That's really bad. That kid will hate his father. And that goes for pastors who are fathers too. I mean, we've got to not have a lot of rules, and we've got to make sure that when we do punish our sons or daughters, that we explain the punishment and that we're not extreme about it either. And that we explain to them that we don't hate them because we're punishing them. We want to teach them a lesson so they won't do this thing again. 1 Peter 5:2-3, be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you are willing. In other words, because you want to, as God wants you to be, not pursuing dishonest gain, but eager to serve, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. So many pastors are abusive and hate their church members, and they hate being pastors. Why? They hate being pastors for the same reason that they hate being fathers. They don't like people. And you're like, well, why are they doing this? I don't know. You know, why are they doing this? God only knows, you know. Maybe they got into it for all the wrong reasons and now they're stuck. Who knows? So some pastors are just confused, right? Here's another one. They pressure their church members to give to the church and they offend in this frequently. Look, everybody needs to ask for donations, but if the pastor doesn't have a side job, if the pastor's wife doesn't have a side job, there's no income coming into the pastor's house at all other than from the church, and there's like literally no backup plan, that's a problem. Paul was a tent maker. Jesus himself was a carpenter, although during the 3-year ministry he wasn't doing that. But Paul, throughout the book of Acts, he boasts of the fact that he works a side job all throughout the New Testament. So I don't have to be a burden to you guys, and I don't have to keep on mentioning this all the time. Abusive pastors lord it over the flock. They require unquestioning submission and obedience to the pastor. One of the dangerous things about charismatics, believe it or not, and Pentecostals is the doctrine of covenant relationships, discipleship, and coverings. This is a doctrine that came into the church in the 1970s through Derek Prince, which honestly has some pretty good stuff to say about spiritual gifts and deliverance, but he also had this thing come in, and he got reprimanded by Pat Robertson on 700 Club, and he got reprimanded by Catherine Coleman as well. Derek Prince taught people in a book called Discipleship and Submission, and he borrowed it, I believe, from Watchman Nee's book, Spiritual Authority. This idea that the pastor is always right, and he has a right to command his church members, and even if he's wrong, he's still right, and that everybody must obey him like a tyrant, literally lording it over the flock, right? And it was called the discipleship movement and stuff like this, and it became a really serious, emotionally abusive problem. And it began in the 70s, and it still exists today in Pentecostal and charismatic churches. John Bevere's book, Undercover, is the major book that still promotes this teaching today. So stay away. If you ever get wise to that, coverings, covenant relationships, run the other direction. That is spiritual abuse in a package. True biblical submission is not unquestioning. It's rational, it's reasonable, it's biblical, it's moral, it's ethical, and most of all, it's loving. Richard Baxter's book, The Reformed Pastor, was the Puritan manual on how to be a pastor. And the focus of it was not on obedience to the pastor. The focus was catechism. The focus was taking the Westminster Confession. The pastor would make visitations to his church members' houses throughout the week. From Monday to Saturday, he would make visitations and see how they were progressing on their catechism knowledge of the Westminster Confession. So the whole mentality, the whole ideology was different. It was the pastor was essentially in an educational role, and he was an educator. That was the Puritan view of the pastor. He was an educator of the Westminster Confession. That was his job. He took the Westminster Confession. Maybe he had a journal of how people were getting along, And he would visit fathers, essentially, in their homes and seeing how they were getting along with the Westminster Confession. That was their job, dude. They were educators, and that was it. I mean, I'm not saying that that's all there was to it, but that was the main focus of Puritan pastoring in the 1600s. And John Wesley required all of his Methodist preachers to read that book. It was required reading. The Reformed Pastor by Richard Baxter. Isaiah 42, verse 3. A bruised reed shall he not break, and the smoking flax shall he not quench. You know, an abusive pastor sees a person that's down, and he kicks a man while he's down. Rather than lifts him up, rather than encourages him, he sees a person that's suffering, and it's like kick a man while he's down. There's absolutely no compassion whatsoever. And you might think, how? How can people get to this point where they're callous and they just don't care? I don't know. Maybe they spent too much time in the business world and that part of them never got sanctified. You know, the idea of a Nazi, just there's this movie called The Hiding Place it's about Corrie ten Boom. And Corrie and her sister, they get thrown into a concentration camp, and there's mud everywhere, and it's just horrible. And there's this Nazi that just keeps beating Corey's sister, and she ends up in the hospital because of it. And Corey's sister's this sweet, frail, godly girl. And there are pastors out there that are like that. They're like a Nazi. It's sad. So love needs to be a huge deal. 2 Corinthians 9:7 says, each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion. So manipulation, guilt tripping, and financial control is really a bad thing. And one of the things I've seen that I think is a cool idea is Calvary Chapel is a denomination where they brought the Old Testament offering chest back. I always thought this was a neat thing. Whenever I saw it, that was a unique thing. And I think the Catholic Church does it as well, where they have these offering chests that are nailed to the ground by the doors. So this brings yet again another measure into the church where the church can receive donations without having to have that awkward moment where the pastor has to talk about it. Well, nobody can walk past the door without seeing the thing, So I always thought that was a nice idea. 2 Kings 12:9, Jehoiada, the priest, took a chest and bored a hole in its lid. Mark 16:17, in my name they will cast out demons. True. But I've mentioned this before that especially in Pentecostal charismatic where they've got this covering authority stuff, there's a lot of just very bad manners when it comes to exorcism, and they will mentally and emotionally abuse people as they exorcise, and it's crazy. So that needs to be avoided, of course. James 5:16, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. Be careful of that verse. You might say, why? Because small group leaders can use your confessions against you and blackmail you. Yeah, it's true. I've seen that happen before. So I would say, look, if you have a sin and you just feel like you need to confess it to a fellow human being, I would just confine that to your spouse, honestly. But we don't live in Catholicism where we feel like we need to confess to some priest. So, but be careful, especially in situations where you don't really know people very well. And now here you are taking your darkest secrets and sharing it with people. That's not wise. 1 Timothy 5:16, do not entertain an accusation against an elder unless it is brought by 2 or 3 witnesses. Especially in abusive contexts where you've got mistreatment, you've got deception, you've got cruelty, you've got emotional abuse going on, and people, the pastor, not apologizing for things, and things are just screwy. And you might be like, might want to say something about it. And you get this kind of this fight or flight situation where it's either A, I'm going to have to leave the church because of the way I'm being treated, or B, I'm going to have to actually bring this issue up, and it's just going to cause a mess. And so let's say you do bring the issue up. Let's say you talk to the pastor or the associate pastor about it, and it's like, and what they do is they go to Matthew chapter 18. Matthew chapter 18. Now here's the problem with Matthew chapter 18. Matthew 18 is the thing where, if you have something against your brother, you're supposed to bring it to the church and talk about it, and if your brother hears you, then everything's okay. But if he doesn't do a second time and a third time, and if he doesn't repent, then, he kicks out of the church, right? I've never seen somebody kicked out of the church over Matthew 18. Never seen it. Usually what I've seen is people are wronged by the abusive pastor and they end up leaving. Matthew 18 is thrown around. The abusive pastor never apologizes for anything. The abusive pastor stays in authority, never reprimanded, never put on discipline, and the people who are hurt just end up leaving. You say, well, that's not biblical discipline. Matthew 18, I believe, the way it's used today is usually used as a way to say, well, this is technically what's supposed to happen, but actually it doesn't. Matthew 18 becomes like a thing that people wave around whenever there's any church problem. Hey, let's bring out Matthew 18, everybody. And it's like, you and I both know nothing's really going to happen here. And the people leave anyway. Why is that? I don't know why. Other than I can tell you this, it's usually taken from this point of view of the pastor is always right and church members are always wrong. It's my word versus your word, and there's nothing anybody can do about it, and nothing's going to change around here. But just so it'll make everybody feel better, we could talk about Matthew 18 if you'd like to. And it's like, yeah, but nobody's going to admit fault. Here's the problem with abuse. There's no acknowledgement that anything is wrong going on, ever. That is one of the telltale signs of abuse. There's no acknowledgement that any insulting or offensive behavior is going on. There's no acknowledgement. People can say things. They can say that they were hurt. They can say that hurt my feelings. They can say all this stuff, but the pastor will not acknowledge it. Why? Because the pastor doesn't want to lose their job. Or the pastor doesn't want to become legally liable. Or some other reason. Or maybe there's just a lot of pride. I don't know. But, it's like, we're going to wave Matthew 18 around. We could do that. See? But they're still not going to be admitting that they did anything wrong. And that's it's scary. It's scary. It's scary for everybody. But it becomes almost like this thing. Matthew 18 becomes this thing where it's a technicality. People are not emotionally healed, and they end up giving some bad review on Google My Business for the church. Some bad review. And you know what? There's always going to be people like that. The question I think everybody in every situation, whether minister or laity or clergy, has to ask themselves is, did I do Matthew 18 properly? Because I don't care if this church, this company, this Christian company institution, which I call a church, I don't care if this church fires me on account of this, that, or the other. Did I apply Matthew 18 properly before God? Did God see me act out Matthew 18 properly towards this guy or this gal? That's all I should care about. Now, that's a place of independence to be in. You know that you're truly free if you can approach Matthew 18 honestly before God and really do it honestly and not deceptively. And I would have to say probably the greatest weakness in this area is financial culpability and financial slavery of pastors. There is a financial slavery that prevents many pastors from being open and honest about actual problems going on with their church members. And there's a lot of image reputation management stuff going on here. And so Matthew 18 gets either abused, glossed over. Matthew 18 type issues get brushed underneath the rug, and people leave. And then they give a bad review of the church or whatever. So I would have to say that in order for Matthew 18 to truly be lived out, for clergy and laity to get along with one another the best that they can, there needs to be some type of tent maker income in the pastor's life. Paul was a tent maker all the time in the Bible. Well up until he died, got his head cut off. He was a tent maker. And you never see Paul skirting around issues or manipulating or finagling his way around Matthew 18. You never see Paul doing that. There is a time where people accuse Paul of being a false apostle, and he takes an entire chapter trying to defend the fact that he was a real apostle. But you never see the Apostle Paul ever trying to skirt around a Matthew 18 type scenario. And why I think that is because he was financially independent, and ain't nobody going to try to make him a dishonest man. He's going to be a straight shooter because the church is not his only form of money. Sure, there's donations. Sure, he might get a stipend every once in a while, but he's always got this other thing on the side. So that if there's anybody that's going to come and mess with his church money, he can walk with integrity and with honesty towards any sort of Matthew 18 objections or problems or accusations that come up against him. Okay. All right, this is going to be a longer one. Let's see. One-upmanship. One-upmanship is an issue that comes up in ministry. Colossians 2:18. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind. What does that have to do with anything? Well, this has to do with prideful, charismatic people. I'm charismatic, but I understand that if I have a vision or I see an angel, I'm not going to go around and say people are disqualified because they haven't had a vision or seen an angel. Maybe they just haven't focused on that part of their life yet, right? Maybe they haven't tried to seek for that yet. You don't have to be a visionary, seer, prophet to be a pastor. All you have to do is be a good family man, love people, love the Word of God, and preach the gospel. But sometimes, especially with charismatics and Pentecostals, you're going to find really puffed up angel people that see visions, which there's nothing wrong with angel people and vision people. I'm an angel person. I'm a vision person. I don't worship angels. But, you can get puffed up with this stuff. And in a day and in an age in which naturalism pervades the church, we should really be going in the opposite direction and doing everything we can to experience angels and visions again. But let's say you are in a church where that's starting to happen. Okay, prophetic ministries in the church, people are seeing angels, people are having visions again. Great. You got biblical discernment, everything's going great, everything's fine, there's even healings breaking out. Great. Just the thing of it is prophetic pride can come into the group. Let no one disqualify you on account of that. Some people are more gifted in the prophetic than others, usually women that pray a lot. So watch out for the Jezebel spirit, which is where you got women that see visions like 10 times more than guys do, and they try to come in and they try to manipulate the pastor with their other visions all the time. You got to be careful of that. You don't want to fight against the Holy Spirit, but you need to be aware of the Jezebel spirit that comes in and tries to boss Elijah around. Anti-intellectualism. Okay. Leonard Ravenhill went to Bible college for 6 months, and then he dropped out because the Lord said, go do something else. Leonard Ravenhill used to crack jokes at seminaries, calling them cemeteries, because they were places where spiritually dead people were born. A lot of Pentecostals and Charismatics, especially, have an anti-intellectual strain, because it's all about the spirit, spiritual experiences. We don't need seminary to have spiritual experiences. All we need to do is worship and pray. But Isaiah 1:18 says, come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. The Bible was formed by people learning how to read and write. So anti-intellectualism is not compatible with Christianity. We're supposed to use our reason. We're supposed to learn how to read and write. And so when pastors preach against reading theology, going to Christian bookstores, studying up to show ourselves approved, they're really going against biblical principles. We shouldn't let our heads be puffed up with knowledge, right? Love is more important. Knowledge puffeth, but love, charity edifies. 1 Corinthians 13. So we need to understand that, but I wouldn't have known that had I not read the Bible in the first place. So anti-intellectualism has no place in the ministry. Medical neglect. James 5:15. James 5:15. The prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. Here's the problem with that verse. Christian Science. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Kenneth Hagin, Positive Confession, and all these guys that name it, claim it. These types of Pentecostals and people, and I'm Pentecostal, okay? I'm not slamming Pentecostals. A lot of these people believe in this mind over matter stuff. And they preach that you should not take medicine, that you'd only pray for healing. They do not go to the doctor, only go to the church and have them pray for you. And I can't tell you how many people have died in certain cults like that. There was a really dramatic case of this in the 80s. There was a church called the Glory Barn. If you look this up, it was called the Glory Barn. Hobart Freeman was the pastor. And he had something like hundreds of people die under his care because he preached that they should not go to the doctor, not go to the hospital, and only come to church for healing prayer. The Glory Barn, Pastor Hobart Freeman. Hundreds of people died under his care because he was preaching against doctors and medicine and preaching only pray for healing. Crazy. Positive confession. Carnality. I'm preaching to myself here. Carnality is a problem in ministry. You think, oh, these guys go to Bible college and they're going to be like living like St. Francis the rest of their life. So you think. You'd think that. I used to think like that when I was like getting ready for that. I was thinking, man, I'm going to be like a Catholic monk the rest of my life, man. Yeah. Let's see how long that lasts. It's not realistic. Um, Matthew 7:15-20. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by your fruits you will know them. You got to be really careful of perfectionism when looking at this. I mean, Jesus, yeah, he's making a distinction. There's a good tree and there's a bad tree. But let's be honest, even in an orchard, when we look at a good tree, there's always going to be some sort of canker worms on them or silkworms or something. I mean, no trees are perfect. Some trees got knots on them, or and when you look at go to a peach orchard. I mean, even the really good trees are going to have some peaches on them that got like little black things on them and stuff, right? And I think that that's a picture of a born again Christian. Is they're not perfect. They still have flesh to fight with. But then there's some trees that are just really bad. I mean, they're just a really bad condition. I mean, they look like they're just made of like warped hickory wood and some driftwood or something. There's like no leaves on them at all. I mean, you could just break that thing and it would, like dust would come out of it. And there's just nothing, right? And that's a picture of a person that's not even born again. And carnality is basically there's no fruit on it. That thing is crisp and ready to be thrown into a bonfire. There's no good fruit on it at all. Ephesians 5:4. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking. If you look at the the Greek in this, pretty sure this is talking about three types of jokes that are not good for Christians. Number one, sex jokes. Number two, roasting, insulting jokes. And number three, blasphemous jokes. Matthew 5:28, I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So all you got to do is look at porn or look at some movie with quasi-porn and you've already committed a breaking of the Ten Commandments there. And I believe probably the easiest way to keep this stuff off of your computer, and it's not a foolproof plan, is to get a router with parental control like the TP-Link Deco M5, and on top of that, any type of Chrome browser extension that might have a porn blocking feature. But even these things are no substitute, because you have to take the addiction and transfer it to revival. Addicted to sermons instead of addicted to something like that. And it's Romans 7 and it's Romans 8, flesh and spirit. But everybody has some sort of an addiction, some sort of an obsession. And if you got to, whether it's that or something else like cigarettes or whatever, you got to transfer it. Listen to nothing but Leonard Ravenhill sermons from there on out. I'll tell you what, I never struggled with anything even close to that when I was in college. Some of it had to do with my Leonard Ravenhill sermons addiction. I think another part of it had to do with the extremely strong routers that my dormitory had to keep that stuff off my computer. False counseling sometimes happens in ministries. Proverbs 11:14, where no counsel is, the people fall. But in the multitude of counselors, there is safety. A lot of pastors, I think, become pastors because they feel called to preach. And then once they learn how to preach and they get to the point where they preach, they think to themselves, well, I guess this is what it means to be a pastor. I'm a preacher. Well, a pastor's more than just a preacher. A pastor is also supposed to be a counselor. And that's a whole nother that's what you call a whole nother level right there. That's a whole nother level. There's a preacher is one thing, right? But a counselor, that's a whole nother level. And I've spoken to some preachers before, um, coming to them for spiritual counseling, and I'm going to tell you what, they were severely lacking in that area. Okay, I'm not kidding. Severely lacking in that area. So I personally believe that pastors seriously need to get some sort of seriously need to get some sort of a counseling license. I'm not saying become a social worker. I'm just saying some sort of a ministerial counseling license, because preaching is going to drive people to the pastor's office, and they're going to be getting all these FAQs that they're going to be like, whoa, dude, I wasn't ready for this. I'm a hellfire preacher and everything, but what is this? And you're getting questions like, so me and my wife have been like going through this thing, and I don't, and you're sitting there like, what? I'm all about saving sinners from hell and preaching about the day of judgment, and now I'm getting this question about marriage issues. And you're like, what in the world, dude? You started off with this thing where it's like, dude, I felt the call to preach, and you answered the call to preach, and you're a preacher, and now you're getting questions about marriage relationships. You're like, what is this? And I think a lot of pastors just aren't ready for that sort of thing. And sometimes they just let years pass, decades pass, and they never, because maybe the questions aren't frequent enough, and they figure, oh, well, I'm not going to get training on this. And sometimes they can just say really ridiculous, rude, and insensitive things to people. I believe that if a person has answered the call to preach in a church setting, they're more than just a street preacher. They need to get some sort of a counseling license. Any sort of a counseling license from an approved body. The American Association of Christian Counselors might be a good one. AACC. The abuse of hell. The abuse of hell in sermons or in counseling. Luke 17:29, the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. That's Jesus. We live in a day and an age in which seeker-sensitive and liberalism pretty much dominates pastoral thinking. So I think most people we're dealing with a lack of hellfire preaching today. A great lack of it. So people abusing the doctrine of hell is like the furthest thing from my mind right now in most churches. It's not even being mentioned. I mean, maybe the word is occasionally mentioned, but as far as like sermons on hell, I can't tell you the last time I saw an entire sermon on hell. Unless I was reading a book by Jonathan Edwards or something. But let's say you're in an ultra-conservative church and the guy actually does preach on hell sometimes. Well, good. Good on him. I'm glad he's doing it. But here's the thing. You can get so used to it that you can overdo it. And people are like little kids even, are getting nightmares. I personally believe that hell is a PG-13 subject and should only be preached to a certain age level. Because if you're really going to preach it fully, the way it's delivered in Scripture, it's basically a rated R subject. I mean, there are things about hell in the Bible that if they were depicted in a movie, you'd have to tell your little kids to leave the room. So, I mean, some people might disagree on that. Preach the gospel to every creature. That's all ages, But really, be honest with yourself. Is hell a rated G subject? I don't think so. So, I mean, if your sermon is so intense that it's going to give kids nightmares, And another thing would be associating certain sins that the Bible has not associated with hell, and being like, if you wear those clothes, you're going to hell. And people throw out if you listen to that CD, you're going to hell. Uh, and then people feel like they're walking on eggshells with God. That's wrong. So only biblical sins, like the ones in the book of Revelation, should be associated with hell. Um, so, like the people who live a lifestyle breaking the Ten Commandments, basically, is what the Bible condemns people to hell for. All liars are cast in the lake of fire. People who lie as a lifestyle, right? No, not people who lie one time, right? And then ask for forgiveness later, right? So some people, you might think, well, that's a given. That's just common sense. Some people don't have common sense. Some people might be like Forrest Gump and a little bit slower in their ability to comprehend certain things. And so we have to try to be very careful in the way we talk about hell. And like I said, I don't think hell is for little kids. I really don't. I could never preach my chapter on hell from Gospel of Jesus Christ to my 8-year-old daughter. I could never do that because she'd have nightmares constantly. I'm talking about, people being dismembered by demons in hell. That's Jesus talks about that. Jesus talks about demons dismembering people with swords in hell. If you're really going to preach hell all the way, I would have to say put an age limit on it. And, otherwise you're talking about psychological problems and stuff like that. So clothing obsessions, oh my gosh, this is so horrible, especially the holiness churches and the Pentecostal churches. The prairie dress thing, man. 1 Peter 3:3-4. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry and fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. Great. Somewhere along the way, this verse got turned into, if you wear a prairie dress, you're going to go to heaven. If you don't wear a prairie dress, you're going to hell. I don't know how we got to that point. Maybe Little House on the Prairie had something to do with it. But there are churches literally that are like, some Baptist churches are like this as well. Dude, take a chill pill. The word prairie dress does not exist in the Bible. It is an 1800s garment from the American West. Get over it. Now, should women be modest? Yeah, but that's subject to interpretation. There's a variety of ways to apply that. God calls us to preach the gospel and to live holy and to obey the Ten Commandments, essentially. But, as far as monitoring, and making women feel self-conscious about their appearance every time they go to church, that is not biblical ministry. Well, that's really all I have to say. This is not just me saying some stuff. This was research-based and observation-based. So this is stuff that a lot of people can resonate with that I've went over today. And, you might have experienced some of these things growing up. And I know I have. And I've been in a lot of different kinds of churches, and it's important for us. I want to just say this one more time again. Richard Baxter's book, The Reformed Pastor, in the 1600s, was the number one way that pastors were. That was the pastor ideology of Protestants for several hundred years, and it's still published today by Banner of Truth. And basically, you get this idea that the main role of a pastor is basically a guy who does visitations throughout the week to see how they're doing on the Westminster Confession, the families. And he's basically visiting the fathers and stuff, um, and just checking up on them, see how they're doing with the Westminster Confession. That was it, man. I mean, I'm not saying that was the only job of a pastor, but there was these one-on-one visitations to seeing how you're doing with catechism in the family. That's it. I was like, wow. So it's this educational role, almost like a tutoring role. The pastor had a tutoring role, a theological tutoring role. The pastor was a theological tutor for every single father in his church. That was what the role of a pastor used to be. And crazy. Totally different than anything I've ever heard today. And anyway, God bless you out there. This is John with WesleyGospel.com.